I know the truth is every one of you have written a book on the Kennedy case. Well, so have I, which obviously doesn't make me very special. I wrote a book called Real Answers, and I defined what I meant by that word or that term in the book, and I'm going to talk to you about it in a little while. But before I actually get to the specifics, let me just kind of tell you why I wrote the book. As some of you know, the one or two of you who have bought my book know this. I ran the investigation, or I say I ran it, I mean I was the sort of the top guy for the staff of the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. I wrote the book because for 20 years after that, I never ran into anyone who wasn't fascinated with the case. And every time it came out that I had been at the top of that staff, I had 45 attorneys, researchers, and investigators working for me and $2.5 million to spend, and they said, "What do you think?" as if it was a secret. It really wasn't a secret, it's just that no one knew what the answer was because it wasn't highly publicized, and frankly I think the news media didn't really like what we found, which was that there was a conspiracy. And so I answered the questions, and over time, over the 20 years, those questions began to kind of, in my head at least, boil themselves down into not that many questions. And so I began to get into a kind of a pattern of explaining my thoughts in response to their questions. And I like to write. I'm a trial lawyer. I write a lot in that capacity. And finally I had some time 20 years later. I never really intended to write a book on the case, but really what drove me to write it was just simply that I wanted to write something, and there aren't very many things in life I know anything about, so I knew something about this one, and this was the subject. Perhaps not a very lofty reason, but that was the truth. I wanted to also write the book because I think that it's easy for those who know a little about this case to think that the world is black and white. I listened with, I guess, amusement and agreement to what my friend Bob Tannenbaum said about Congress and how inappropriate an organization that is to do an investigation. I don't know Bob well, but I know a good friend of Bob's really well, who's also a good friend of mine. In fact, his name is Kenny Klein, and he was the deputy under me, and he was there when Bob was there, and he and Bob have been friends for years. And it sounds silly, but you know, any friend of Kenny's is a friend of mine. And I think when Bob told you about the kind of horror experience he had with Congress during the time he was there, that's, I'll bet you, the absolute truth. I've heard the same kind of stories about other people, from other people who were there. It really wasn't my experience. Although I have to agree with Bob that if you were to pick the best of all entities or forms to do an investigation, it probably wouldn't be Congress. I might not in public comment on congressmen quite in the forthright manner that Bob did, but I had my own views. I'd been to Washington twice in my career. I started out in 1970 there when I joined the organized crime section. I didn't want to go back. In fact, when I was offered the job, I turned it down. And some weeks later, I finally reconsidered, and I flew over, and Bob Blakey talked me into coming back to Congress, and he said, "We got the staff in place, and we got all this money, and I want you to come see what the setup is and see if I can talk you out of it." Actually, I was on my way to Alaska at the time, and I was in a mobile home in Colorado halfway there. And I left my wife and two friends in the mobile home and got on an airplane, and they were just stuck in a trailer park there in Colorado, and I flew back, and Bob Blakey said, "Look, here's the deal. We got 45 attorneys, researchers, and investigators. You got $2.5 million to spend. and if you come run this investigation, you can run it however you want. That's maybe a slight exaggeration, but I knew Bob, knew him for years. Very few people in the United States could say that. I thought he was one of the ones that could say it and carry it off. Let me make something clear before I go any further. My book is called Real Answers. It doesn't mean it's the truth. If you want the answer to any of the subjects I'm going to talk to you about, wait till you die and ask God. A real answer to me is really one based on the available, credible evidence. Obviously, a lot of the real answers I'll give you are just my impressions. And I'm going to tell you another thing. I'm not here without a tie on with any disrespect. My wife thought, I said, I'm not going to wear a tie today. And she said, well, you can't do that. That's disrespectful to those people. And I said, no, I don't think so. A tie can mean a lot of things. It can be a symbol of respect. And all the people up here wore ties. Probably for that reason. I chose not to wear a tie for a different reason. Ties are also symbols of authority. I'm not here to talk to you as an authority. I'm not here to tell you the answers. I am going to tell you some of the things that I think are real answers if you define it the way I did. It's the best answer that I could find after spending a lot of money and a lot of hours based on what I thought was the credible evidence. Now, my experience was different than Bob Tannenbaum's. To me, the committee didn't have those problems. They didn't take our postage away. I did do what I wanted to do. Never once in the scope. Now, that doesn't mean what I did is perfect. Don't misunderstand me. But nobody ever came to me and said, don't do this. Color it this way. Now, why is that? Was there a different Congress than Bob ran into? No. Were there no biases in the Congress that the committee members that we had? Absolutely. That would be ludicrous. Show me the man without a bias and I'll show you a guy who's already died. They had their biases. In fact, there's a really, really funny cartoon that we did some of our stuff in a closed session initially, and then it all became public later. But at this particular point, it was a closed session. And when we finally got the conspiracy evidence, the acoustics that said there were 4 shots fired and at least 2 shooters, we presented that to the committee in closed session. No one was supposed to know at that point in time. We made it public very shortly thereafter, of course, but at that point it was a closed session. One of the congressmen, when the evidence was presented, put his briefcase under his arm and started out the door and said, well, Lou, to the chairman of the committee, I won't be able to serve on the select committee anymore. I got to go on to more important affairs of Congress. They didn't like it, or at least a lot of them didn't like it. So sure, they had notions, they had biases like everybody does, me included. But the evidence was made public. And in fact, when they wrote the report, they had the guts to say, we think this is valid evidence and we think it shows a conspiracy. Now, as we went through, let me just kind of, so I wanted to actually write a book so that at least anyone that was interested could at least hear the way I saw it. We did things. There are ways to do things that make an investigation, even by Congress, more effective. The Warren Commission sure didn't do them. But we did. We granted immunity. We compelled parents of people that didn't want to show their, including mafia guys. I mean, we tried to use the available tools. And look, this isn't a perfect world. This is a tough case. And you tell me an entity that can do a perfect job with it, and again, I bet it doesn't exist in this world. About the only thing really I disagreed with Bob Tannenbaum on, and I'm not sure I really disagree with him on this either, it just depends on how you interpret his phrasing, was that he thought, he kind of emphasized to you how much better it would have been for a prosecutor to do this investigation. Well, let me tell you, I was prosecutor for 7 years. I was with the organized crime section of the Justice Department. I convicted maybe 100 mafia guys over the years. I ran grand juries. I was in charge of a multi-state region. I had 6 lawyers working for me. I supervised the FBI, the DEA, the Secret Service, all the federal agencies. You think that was perfect? Oh, I wouldn't want to tell you some of the things we did. I mean, we tried to be honest. We tried to present credible evidence. It is a good process. I agree with Bob. We're both prosecutors. We've seen that. It's a good system. Most prosecutors take it really seriously. Most prosecutors really do try to do the right thing. But they're not perfect either. They got their biases. They start from preconceived notions. They're like all the rest of us. We ought to be thankful we had the Select Committee on Assassinations, I think. Because there's a world of new data in those reports. There's new findings. There's new perspectives. And God, did we need it after the Warren Commission, right? Let me tell you, they asked me to come here and they said, pick your topic. So I said, well, gee whiz, I know a little bit about a lot of things. What would I want to talk about? I said, well, let me just talk to you about the most significant finding of the Select Committee on Assassinations. The most significant finding. What is it? I'll bet you I'm not going to do this. This is the way I do when I do with high school classes, but you're kind of a little too big for that. But I say, what do you think? And what do you think, And I'll bet you if I went around the room, some of you would say, well, the fact that you found there was 4 shots. The fact that you found there was a conspiracy. Now what I'm getting ready to say is, I'm saying it a little bit for exaggeration. There's some exaggeration here. But in one sense, if I could tell you the answer, who was the second shooter? What could you do with it? Where would you go? You think they'd convict him after 40 years? Think he's even alive after 40 years? If he is, maybe he's one of these guys that have been confessing recently. I think the most significant finding of the Select Committee on Assassinations was, ironically, also the strongest finding. If anybody asks you about the Kennedy case and what you think, or at least when they ask me, this is what I always do. I always start out and I say, well, look, before I answer a question, let me tell you, what I think about the Kennedy case depends entirely upon what part of it you're asking me about. Because don't forget, we did our investigation 15 years after the fact. And the degree of certainty that we were able to reach, even in our own minds, varied significantly. Some things I can tell you without, in my mind, really any doubt. There is no credible argument to the contrary. Very few of those. The opening sentence in my book says something like this. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was shot and killed on November 22nd, 1963 while riding in a motorcade in Dealey Plaza. That's also, incidentally, the first sentence of our committee report, which I and others wrote. It, in one sense, is the only thing that there is basically no disagreement about in this case. That's it. I've summed up all the facts for you. The ones we know to an absolute certainty. But actually, there's another one that I can tell you to essentially the same degree of certainty. The Warren Commission never conducted a conspiracy investigation. Never, never, never. It didn't exist. That, to me, is the most significant finding that we made. Let me tell you, though, before I tell you more about that, I'm going to tell you why I think it's so significant, and I'm going to tell you how we got there. We started out, and we read all the books that everyone had written between 1963 and 1977. We tried to figure out all the different theories. We tried to figure out, if you're going to do a murder investigation, you got to look at least the sort of basic concept of motive, opportunity, and means. Well, how many people, if I pick one of you out of the audience, how many people do you think have the motive, opportunity, and means to kill you? Hopefully not many. You've had a relatively good life, right? In Kennedy's case, it's not just bunches of people, it's bunches of groups. He went to the brink of war with Russia. They're a suspect. He pulled the air cover off of the Bay of Pigs. The anti-Castro Cubans are suspects. The CIA had a plot to assassinate Castro. Castro is a suspect. The right-wing extremists in the South hated him for his liberal civil rights policy. They're suspects. So we tried to take these and look at all of the different things. I mean, you go through the Warren Commission, and here's what you see. Every time there was an issue relating to Oswald, their investigation was fairly extensive. Whether you like it, whether you disagree with it, whether you think they ended up on the right conclusion or not, it was fairly extensive. Maybe it's because they wanted to pin it on him. But whatever your view of that is, it was extensive. When you go through the FBI reports of the Warren Commission and it was a conspiracy issue, they dropped it like a hot potato. It's like you would come to me, and if I'm the FBI, and you say, that guy over there knows Oswald, I'd say, you know Oswald? Well, gee whiz, everyone knows the guy's been killed by Jack Ruby, and he's the chief suspect in the case. Whether he knows Oswald or not, what do you think he's going to say? Never heard of the guy. And, it's... Some guy did that to Jesus once, if you remember. I don't know the guy, right? Well, that was good enough for them. That was the end of that. And as we went through all of these conspiracy issues, investigating them, two things, for the first 6 months of our investigation, two things were fairly consistent. Every conspiracy theory that we looked at turned out to be, in our view, not right. There was a flaw in it. And some of the time it was because whoever it was that wrote the book or came up with the theory was a flake. Some of the time it was, and more often, most of the people that looked at this stuff were sincere, honest, straightforward, concerned people who were doing the best they could in the face of reading the Warren Commission investigation and seeing that it was a farce. But nevertheless, as we looked at the books, we just kept, finding that we didn't believe the conspiracy theory. At the same time, however, it became crystal clear to us that the Warren Commission didn't intend to investigate the conspiracy issue. So what we then began to do is we started asking questions. And I deposed J. Lee Rankin, former Solicitor General, Chief Counsel. I deposed Gerald Ford, flew out there to Vail, met him in his home, questioned him live on national TV. I loved his testimony. I recited it in my book. He said, I unequivocally deny that there was any deficiency in the Warren Commission's investigation. Well, I deposed the guys on the Warren Commission. And as you might expect, I would say to them, why did you guys do it this way? And I got a lot of defensiveness. Now, why did they do it that way? Why did they do it that way? Well, you know what Oliver Stone tells us. It's because it was a government conspiracy and they covered it up by destroying all the evidence. Now, I don't want to launch into all the details because what I'm really here to do is kind of get you to think through with me, the thought processes, and at least play with me the game for a little while of looking for a real answer. So, not that I'm trying to tell you this is the answer, or I just could use this for illustrative purposes. You guys that saw the Oliver Stone movie, you will remember that his premise was it was a government conspiracy, and he had two basic prongs of proof. One, there was no evidence that there was a government conspiracy. Circular. His reasoning basically was the government was involved, the government killed the president, therefore the government conducted the investigation, therefore the government destroyed all the evidence, therefore there's no evidence. Okay? And then, of course, there was Deep Throat, the Donald Sutherland guy. And, of course, Garrison and Stone admitted that Garrison never had any such conversation with anybody and didn't go to Washington ever during the course of the investigation. So I just point that out, not that you agree with me, not that that's the whole story, of course, but for illustrative purposes. Does the fact that I can stand here and cut down that premise for the movie, does that mean the government didn't do it? Of course not. Could the government have done it? Of course. Has there ever been, in my view, a credible case with hard, credible evidence proving that the government did it? I don't think so. What did we find? Well, you know, and this is interesting to me, and maybe this is just sour grapes on my part, because when the movie started, you know, I called up there, and they were getting ready to produce the thing, and I said, look, my name's Gary Cornwell. I ran the investigation for the House of Representatives. I said, look, I'm not looking for publicity. I'm not looking that you use my name. I'm not looking for money. I don't expect you to ever mention my name or pay me anything. But if there's anything I can do to help you, tell you where to look for stuff, tell you who the witnesses might be, whatever it might be, I'll drive to Dallas and do it, just because I think it'd be a public service. And they said, no, sir, we know the story we want to tell. Stay in Houston. So what did we come up with? Well, I think it's just as interesting a story. It's probably a bigger story. It's a more interesting story. It's a story that, in fact, based on the evidence, I think is the real answer. Let me just go through a few highlights of what I think the answer is. And this is after asking Gerald Ford and everyone else and getting this baloney that they did a great job. Finally, I get into, and this is all, you know, laid out in the book, if numbered 3 or 4, if you ever want to read it. It's in more detail in there. I got Nicholas Katzenbach in my office. And Katzenbach was the guy that sort of was behind putting the Warren Commission together. And Katzenbach's story to me was basically that all these rumors and speculations were a huge problem to them in running the government. Internationally, assassinations have typically been power takeovers. Everyone thought Johnson did it, everyone thought the CIA did it, on and on and on. And they literally put the wheels of government into gear to convince the American public that Lee Harvey Oswald was a sole assassin. In fact, let me see if I can read you this thing real quickly here. On November 25th, 1963, Mr. Katzenbach writes a memo to Bill Moyers in the White House. And here's what it says. Now, you understand this is 2 days after the assassination. This is Monday, right? This is Monday, November 25th. Oswald was just killed the day before. The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who were still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial. Speculation about Oswald's motivation ought to be cut off. The matter has been handled thus far with neither dignity nor conviction. Isn't that interesting? Certainty, authority, right? What's he talking about? The charade in the Dallas Police Department mainly. He doesn't like that. He wants an authoritative answer. He He wants to consider, the White House to consider, the appointment of a presidential commission of unimpeachable personnel to review and examine the evidence and announce its conclusions. When you read that memo, there isn't a single word in there about. Now let's think about this. Who might best investigate? Is a presidential commission best structured to investigate? This is the point Tannenbaum's making. Who is the best entity? What is the best entity? They never gave it any thought. They could have cared less. It was to convince. That's the reason it was a blue ribbon panel. 2 senators, 2 congressmen, head of the World Bank, former head of the CIA. Furthermore, who was their only investigator? J. Edgar Hoover. Well, need I say more? Well, I will anyway. On November 24th, the second day after the assassination and just hours after Oswald had been shot and killed in the Dallas Police Department by Jack Ruby, Hoover had a telephone conversation with President Lyndon Johnson in which Hoover said, "The thing I am most concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." Wow. Sunday afternoon, Oswald was killed that morning. The next day is the Bill Moyer memo on Tuesday. Let's see here. We have then the next day, 4 days after the assassination, Hoover gets a memo from an assistant director, and the director says, the assistant director, "We must recognize that a matter of this magnitude cannot be fully investigated in a week's time." In a notation on the memo, Hoover scratches this note. "Just how long do you estimate it will take? It seems to me we have the basic facts right now." Wow. 3 days later, November 29th, this is Friday, 1 week after the assassination, Hoover records a memo and a conversation with President Johnson. "I advise the President that we hope to have the investigation wrapped up today, but probably won't have it before the first of the week, due to an additional lead being pursued." An additional lead. Now, the FBI, he didn't quite get that lead wound up as quick as he hoped. The FBI's report setting forth its conclusions that Oswald was acting alone and killed the president was transmitted to President Johnson by Deputy Attorney General Katzenbach, still involved, 1 week after the Warren Commission was created. It took the Warren Commission another 9 months to, quote, "review and examine the evidence and announce its conclusions," to use Katzenbach's memo for the phrasing. Now, you all know some probably really bad things about Hoover, but let's just talk about the one thing we can say with an absolute high degree of certainty. Hoover ran the FBI with an iron hand. Hoover never let anyone criticize the FBI. If there was the slightest criticism of the FBI, he jumped on them, as we say in Texas, like a duck on a June bug. As Katzenbach said, Hoover was strongly opposed to the creation of the Warren Commission and considered the mere formation of the commission to be a slap at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For Mr. Hoover, anything that was not lavish praise was terrible criticism. Unjustified criticism, by the way. The FBI's response to Katzenbach and the others who formed the Warren Commission was to stonewall the commission, and that's Katzenbach's testimony. So, you can go on and on, you know, it's kind of the favorite horse we all beat, you know. I mean, gee whiz, you come to a conference like this, everybody's ready to beat the horse. You know, you don't have to beat this horse to death. It's the simplest thing in the world. If they had to investigate the mafia. There wasn't a single lead run out during the Warren Commission's investigation by the organized crimes, by the FBI's organized crime squad or the Justice Department's organized crime squad. If you were going to investigate this case at all, you had to look at the anti-Castro Cubans. They had military groups strewn them down our south coast, our Gulf Coast. The CIA was financing half of them and monitoring the rest of them. They had cabinets full of stuff on the CIA, on the anti-Castro Cubans. The CIA had cabinets full of stuff on that. All these guys that are now of such interest to everybody, the CIA's files were full of this stuff. And yet, did any of it get to the Warren Commission? No. In our investigation, the CIA testified that if the Warren Commission had wanted something, we assumed they'd asked for it. And the Warren Commission guys testified that we assumed if the CIA had anything, they would have given it to us. Now, what can we learn? What can we learn? Well, one of the things we can learn, I can illustrate to you with this, and I'm just picking illustrations because, again, I'm not here to give you the answers. You get the answers. I'm here to talk to you about a process, some things that might be helpful in getting there. When our book came out, the one me and my staff wrote, 200 pages and thousands of pages of testimony, $2.5 million, which was some money back in '77. Tom Wicker, this was published by Bantam in paperback. Tom Wicker, associate editor of the New York Times, wrote the introduction to the book, right? Now, Tom Wicker's a bright guy, I assume. Associate editor of the New York Times. Here's what he had to say. Now, I brought my book so I can quote this from you, because if I just stood up here in front of you and told you what Tom Wicker had to say, you wouldn't believe me. I'm going to read you his exact words. He concluded that the Warren Commission was right and we were wrong. Lee Harvey Oswald did it, sole assassin, no conspiracy. That was his conclusion. But it's his rationale that's so important. I do so not least because I have always thought that Oswald acted alone when he killed Kennedy. Ha! There's a reason for you. He'd always thought that he didn't care what we did. He could have cared less. And this next one's even better. I believe that it is the way things happen. Ours is a world not so much of plans and conspiracies, but of chance, circumstance, and individuality, against which not even presidents can always be immune. He concluded Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone because he thinks that's the way the world works. Now, here's my point. And I talk about this in the book. We often think of bias as something dumb people have. And the reason we think of it that way is because we all kind of know that a bias is a generalization and that every generalization has exceptions, so it's always not true. A racial bias. You pick it. I don't care what. We go through life making generalizations and gathering data, and the result of that we form generalizations. That's the same thing as a bias. Okay? But it's not the dumb people that are really most affected by that, it's the smart people, I think. Because the smart people are able to rationalize. And furthermore, the danger with bias is the smart ones think they're above it. I wouldn't engage in a bias. I don't have generalizations. So then their reasoning power rationalizes their conclusion without them ever even admitting that they started from a biased position. I guess I got to at least hand it to Tom Wicker. He at least admitted his bias, right? Biases are not good or bad, incidentally. They can be very good. In fact, that's another one of my points. The Warren Commission, I think, the real answer, based on just as I see it, the most credible body of evidence is the Warren Commission had a bias in favor of the lone assassin theory because it would help them run the government and help them run the world and get this distraction off their desk. Now, mind you, they could have been evil men. They could have known that the government did it. The odds are probably against that, but it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I mean, these were, you know, the head of the U.S. Supreme Court, etc. These are probably pretty honorable guys, generally speaking. It does shock me how they fail to, you know, admit the truth. And it shocks me that they lied to us when they wrote the Warren Commission's final report and said if there was evidence of conspiracy, it was beyond the reach of the government. I mean, that's pretty shocking stuff. But it doesn't mean they killed him. It doesn't mean they know who killed him. But you know, forget Oliver Stone's wild theory. What a shocking deal this is, right? Our government, the most prestigious guys we could come up with, lied to us. Blatantly, unequivocally. Anyone tells you the contrary is not telling you. It's the one thing we can say. It's the finding of the Select Committee on Assassinations that is the most important single finding we made, and the one we made with the highest degree of certainty. But don't think it affects just the guys that think that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. It affects the guys that thinks there was a conspiracy too. Let me just illustrate the point. I don't mean to pick on anybody, because I think one thing that we do wrong in this Kennedy case is we always take it personally. We always want to destroy somebody. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's take the single bullet theory. They talked about it this morning. The single bullet theory was criticized because of all the mistakes they made when they came up with it. All right? We all know that. The pathologists couldn't figure out, they didn't know what standard anatomical points were, so they misplaced the bullet wound. And, you know, I broke Hume on that, you know, in cross-examination during the public hearings, and he finally confessed that for 15 years he'd been lying about that. So, it's easy to criticize the single bullet theory. Now let's turn it around. Let's don't let our biases get carried away here. What about the other side? What about the criticisms of the single bullet theory? Well, you heard some of them here this morning. One of them is that, well, the Zapruder film is a clock. It's a timepiece. Wrong. I think. I mean, I'm just giving you my opinion. It may be the most interesting piece of evidence we have. It's not a clock. The reason it's not a clock is there's only one place on there you can tell what's happening. When the bullet hits the head. What was that? Frame 313 or something? Every other event on there is an inference. If you're talking about when the bullets hit, you're drawing inferences backwards from body reactions which you can't see clearly except with respect to the bullet hitting the head. You didn't see that one. I'm telling you, I described this in my book. I had an accident one time. I went through a bunch of brush skiing. I tore my face all apart. I stuck a huge stick in my hip. I swam to the boat. I walked to the car. I looked in the mirror. My face was torn completely off. My eyeball was sticking out there with no skin around it. I wasn't hurting. I didn't even realize I'd really been hurt, other than the fact that when I got out of the water, I felt something laying on my cheek. I said, that feels funny. I wondered if my eye fell out, and I went like this, and I said, oh, I'm fine, I can see. And the criticisms of the single bullet theory, in large part, depend upon how fast someone reacts when they get hit with a bullet. How do we know that? How many people have been shot and filmed getting hit with bullets? How fast is the reaction? We don't know. Furthermore, we heard today, you criticize the single bullet theory because the FBI proved unequivocally you can't shoot a gun that fast. You heard that right here this morning. It takes 2.2 seconds. Wrong. Go back and read it. Here's what the FBI did. They put in their mind an assumption before they ever went to the firing range, which was that Oswald shot through the scope. Why in the world would you make that assumption, since this is the machinations of, if he was the guy, a sick mind? You're going to try to figure out what was in his mind? Give me a break. Why didn't he use the open scope, the open sights? They were right there and right on top. Why the FBI decided they had to find that target in that scope, which takes longer, and then fire and get to 2.2 seconds is beyond me. So I took the exact gun out to Quantico, Oswald's gun. I threw it up, and I didn't make any real assumption. I just said, how fast can the gun be shot? Because everyone had been telling me all these times, you can't shoot it in less than 2.2 seconds. Well, I shot it. It was, you heard today, can't be done. Well, That's not right. I did it. 1.6 seconds. Bang, bang, bang. You can work Oswald's gun and put a bullet in the target. It's a short little shot in 1.6 seconds. You don't have to add up 2.2 times 2.2, etc., and find out it's only 5.6 or 7. The whole analysis, the whole criticism of the single bullet theory is wrong. Now, whether the single bullet theory is right or wrong, that's up to you. But don't let your bias in favor of conspiracy carry you away either. You know, in Africa, when they shoot at moving targets, dangerous game, they use open sights. They don't use scopes. Most of them don't even have scopes in their gun. Why would you ever assume that Oswald, in a little short shot like that, would use a scope? Now, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But why do your whole test around the assumption that he did? The least knowable of all the things we can know is what was going through Oswald's mind. And furthermore, don't forget this. I love this one. The FBI decided not only did they need to look through the scope, they needed to be sure they hit the target. Why? Maybe to save embarrassment, but more likely because, I guess, Oswald hit the target. Well, did he hit the target? What about that chip over there? You know, 100 yards away on the curb. If he was taking all of his time to be so dadgum sure he put the bullet exactly right here in Kennedy's neck, how did it, I mean, if it was Oswald. I mean, you know, again, we can argue over whether it was Oswald or somebody else, but I'm just talking about what can you know? And keep your mind open. Don't let your bias just let you latch on to anything to make your point. My God, that's the reason we criticize the Warren Commission. That's the reason they went haywire. That's the reason we can't believe anything they say. Don't let it happen to you. Now, here's another reason. How much time do I have? I'm probably over. At any rate, stop me whenever you need to. Let me tell you another reason why this is the most significant finding that we made. I could use a lot of examples. I'm not picking on Mr. Clinton. He just happens to be one of my... I like the example of him and Monica. Let's put it that way. I'm going to use it to illustrate this. You remember when he got caught? He stood up and he said, look, the important thing was I doing a good job running the government? Don't worry about this stuff. Don't worry about this. It's not important. You know, the truth is, he would be right in most countries in the United States, in the world. But President Clinton forgot where he was. He forgot what his role is. He forgot he was in the United States of America. We're supposed to be running this country, not Mr. Clinton. And you know, almost invariably, you guys are an exception. You're out digging up your own data. But generally, most information in our country comes from the government. They got the power, they got the resources, they got the money to investigate. If they keep that data and they don't give it to you, they disenfranchise you, they take your vote away, they take your power away, they turn this country upside down. And then, of course, Clinton says, well, and furthermore, it wasn't important. It was just my private life. Well, you know, I'm an old prosecutor. And I'm not saying Clinton is corrupt. Far from it. Don't anyone say I'm saying Clinton is corrupt. I want to illustrate a point for you. The way corruption works is a stick and a carrot. The first thing that the corrupter does is find something the public official feels he cannot afford to make public. Maybe a crime, maybe an indiscretion. And then he gives the guy a carrot. Something he wants done, and he says, this is in the public interest that you do this. It's also in my interest, of course. You understand, I'm the corrupter, but you know. Now, during the time that Clinton is telling us that this is only his private life, he's also telling us it's good to sell secrets to the Chinese, high-tech secrets to the Chinese. Now, we all know that all the countries of the world tap each other's phones, and we all know that the conversations between Clinton and Monica were over unsecured lines. And furthermore, so maybe the Chinese knew long before we did. And we know that Clinton wanted to silence Monica because when she was getting a little unruly, he said, go out there and get her a job, boys, see if you can keep her happy. And on top of everything else, Monica and her friends knew about this long before the rest of us did. So, just like the Warren Commission, Clinton says, I get to decide what you get to get, and I get to decide whether it's important for you to get it. Was his relationship with Monica something that needed to be classified? Was it some, I mean, there are such things, you know, but was this one of them? I don't think so. So when are we going to learn this lesson? That's the reason this is one of the most significant findings of the Select Committee on Assassinations. When I stand here in front of you and tell you what these guys did, you can apply that to your life as citizens of the United States. The other thing that I think is so significant about this is that it teaches us another lesson. You know, my kids, I've got 11 kids and I don't know what, maybe 20 grandkids now. And so, you know, from time to time, I know you're going to find it hard to believe that someone in my family would do this, but from time to time, my kids will think it's okay to lie. And I say to them, you know, number one, why should I even talk to you if you're lying? I mean, what's the purpose of a conversation if it isn't the exchange of truth? But more importantly, I say to them, you know, they say, well, I was afraid you were going to do this to me or that. I say, well, you know, anybody can tell the truth when it's easy. The question is, can you tell the truth when it's hard? The Warren Commission didn't want to tell us the truth because they didn't think we could handle it. Let me leave you with this. I want to just, my conclusion is as follows. I want you to understand what I've been talking about in terms of real answers. Real answers, and I'm going to read you just one little passage from my book, because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what these words were, and I did it once the way I liked it. I'll just read it to you. Real answers inherently are honest answers. And honesty requires the restraint not to assert as facts that which is only suspicion, that which is not reasonably supported by available, credible evidence. In the beginning, it is necessary to start with the right attitude. I am critical of the Warren Commission for not wanting to find a conspiracy. Jim Garrison clearly wanted to find a conspiracy. Yet I'm also critical of his investigation, not for where or how it started, and in fact not even for some of the findings he made, which I think were credible, but for where it ended. In the end, real answers require more than a desire to look. They also require candor and objectivity. Sometimes the real answer is simply that we don't know for sure what the answer is. A real answer also recognizes and acknowledges that the limitations of our ability to know, recognizes and acknowledges the limitations of our ability to know the ultimate truth. As the Select Committee gathered more and more data, I gradually came to realize that every presumed fact can be, and perhaps in some sense should always be, questioned. From the investigation, I came to recognize that often the more you study an issue and the more evidence you gather, the more clearly you are able to see how much you do not know. Isn't it often those who know little who presume they know it all? Even the most basic facts that govern our lives, the truths upon which we were raised concerning health and illness, mind and body, and even life and death, are still in the process of being reshaped by the latest scientific and medical discoveries and the religious and philosophical thinkers of our day. If it were not for our belief that we already had the answers, real knowledge would clearly progress even more rapidly. But somehow we seem to overlook this lesson in studying history. We tend to hold fast to what we think we know and resist admitting that we may have been wrong and need to think again. During the course of the investigation, I acquired a small plaque on which is engraved the inscription, "A fact merely marks the point at which we have all agreed to let investigation cease." That is the ultimate truth that studying the Kennedy case can teach you. Did Oswald fire the shots that killed the president? I believe the real answer is yes, at least if you define real answers to mean those that are indicated by the evidence we have available to us at the point in time where we agreed to allow investigation to cease, we on the Select Committee. Within that definition, I believe that the real answer is that there was a conspiracy and that there were two shooters who fired at the presidential limousine. Those, of course, may or may not be the points at which you decide to let investigation cease. Thank you for having me come.